The Adventures of Tommy Postoffice, The True Story of a Cat, by Gabriel E. Jackson. Chapter 1. Tommy's First Appearance. Meow, 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 meow. The first sound came from a dark corner in the cellar of the R. Post Office, far in behind some stored-away mail pouches, and the second was its answer, as a fine black and white cat made her way daintily across the dusty pouches, shaking first one foot and then another, to free them from any dirt which might adhere to them, before entering the corner from which the first cry proceeded. And, indeed, she had reason to guard those snowy stockings she wore, for she had taken infinite pains to wash them until they were immaculate. Have the first sounds betrayed the secret of that dark corner? It was a spot rarely visited by the post office officials, and that was the very reason it had been sought out by this mother cat, for, hidden there upon some soft old leather pouches, were 5 wee, squirming kittens, which were clamoring for their dinner, and their mother, the pet of every one in the office, was coming with it just as fast as any mother could. She had stolen away, while her babies were fast asleep, to visit Jimmy, the engineer. For Jimmy and Peggy Post Office were boon companions and shared a dinner daily. As Peggy picked her way along she gave an occasional lick to her lips, for thereupon still lingered both taste and odor of a fine bit of cold roast beef. A moment later she was crooning to her children as only a loving old mother cat can. Meantime, events were hurrying along above stairs. The great mail wagons had backed up to the post office to take their load of outgoing letters. Carriers were hurrying in from all parts of the city with their letter bags filled with mail matter. The clerks were rushing about the office, and Uncle Sam was being served with alacrity. "Who ever heard of such a rush of mail at this season of the year? A month later there might be some sense in it. Haven't half enough bags to hold it all. Where are all those reserve ones, Pete? Hustle downstairs and get up half a dozen of them, will you?" called the head of the department. Pete, the general factotum of the post office, gave one bound over the pile of bags which were already upon the floor, tore through the door, and vanished below stairs. About 10 minutes elapsed, and then he came struggling up the stairs, bearing in his arms 2 of the cumbersome mail pouches, talking what seemed to be a string of unintelligible nonsense, and chuckling as though he knew a huge joke. "Hustle, you boy, I say! Don't keep the whole office waiting. Why, what?" And every man in the department followed the speaker as he hurried toward the struggling Pete. Some held a handful of letters, some an open mail pouch which they were about to swing upon the supporting frame. "How's that for a fine showin' for the lady of the post office? Ain't that as dandy a litter as you ever clapped your eyes on? 5 of 'em, and every one a beaut. Here's the very mother's son of 'em," cried Pete, as he held up by its wee neck-handle a tiny reproduction of Peggy Post Office. White nose, white shirt front, white stockings, white tail tip, and all complete. 5 pairs of bright little eyes blinked at the men in the brilliant sunlight of the office. 5 little mouths squealed in chorus. 5 cunning kittens not 2 weeks old squirmed and wriggled about upon the mail pouch, while their proud but somewhat anxious mother warbled to them reassuringly, and rubbed herself against the legs of the admiring audience. Mr. Wilson, the head of the department, chuckled with delight as he said, "Peggy, old girl, you've done yourself proud this time, and no mistake." Then one of the men lifted the cat to the table where the kittens were being admired. Peggy fully appreciated the honor, but was filled with maternal solicitude for her family, as kittens have been known to disappear mysteriously when discovered by even the most cherished and trusted friends. "Where did you find her, Pete?" asked Mr. Wilson. "I've hunted in every hole and corner for those kittens without discovering even a hair." "On these bags, way over in the corner of the cellar. Great old cat," was the reply. "Well, next thing to be done is to fix up a box for her ladyship. As soon as we get this mail off to it, will you, Pete? Put her down behind my desk. It's sort of dark and snug there, and I guess she'll like it and let them stay if we don't bother her too much." An hour later Peggy Post Office and her family were as snug as bugs in a rug. Pete had found a good-sized box, filled it half full of excelsior, and placed it behind Mr. Wilson's desk, and there was as soft a bed as any reasonable cat could wish for. Mrs. Post Office and her family were at home, and had they been content to remain there, this history of Tommy Post Office would never have been written. However, true to her instincts, this mother cat detested a change. In her eyes, no spacious box ever made, or the softest excelsior ever shaved up, could compare with that dark corner of the cellar, safe from inquisitive, even though admiring eyes, and near the familiar odor of the old leather mailbags. For some unknown reason, a heavier mail was passing through the R office, just then, than had ever been known at that season of the year, for Thanksgiving mails are not, as a rule, heavy ones. The men were exceptionally busy. A night or two after Peggy had taken up her abode behind Mr. Wilson's desk, the night shift of clerks was just coming on, and there was the usual bustle and hurry of the exchange. Nobody thought of Peggy, and she was very glad of it, for she had a little scheme to carry out, and preferred doing so unaided. The men were working rapidly upon the outgoing Eastern mail, for it would close in 10 minutes, and that meant to work as fast as possible. "Here, Pete, set up another bag for Hartford. This one will burst for sure, if there's any more jammed into it. Don't like to send out a bag with hardly a handful of letters in it, but this one won't hold another letter," cried Mr. Wilson, as he struggled to fasten a mail bag which was almost bursting with the number of letters which had been crowded into it. Pete swung another pouch upon the supporting bars. An armful of letters was dropped into it. Click! Went the clasp, and the bag was fastened, not to be opened again until the Hartford post office was reached the following morning. When Mr. Wilson came to his desk the next morning, and peeped behind it to say "Good morning" to the family residing in the box of Excelsior, Tommy Post Office was missing. Peggy meowed and tried to tell him what had happened, but Mr. Wilson had never studied cat Latin. More than 12 hours had passed since that mail pouch was clicked together in the R office, and then, far away in one of the New England states, on a Thanksgiving morning, a strange scene took place, one that the post office officials had not arranged for. "Hustle, boys! Hustle! Hustle! Uncle Sam doesn't often give his officials a half holiday. Thanksgiving comes but once a year, and my landlady has the prize turkey of the town waiting for me up yonder. I know all about him, for I bought him for her, and he's a dandy," cried Robert Weston, as he bustled about in his quick, energetic manner, doing more in 1 minute than the average man could compass in 10. "Open up those pouches, Ben. All fired lot of them for a Thanksgiving mail. Where is this one from? R? Wonder what the Empire State has got to tell about this time. Down, Coco. What's the use of you trying to stick your inquisitive nose into this fuss? You just keep yourself cool and collected. We can attend to this business and not half try." The last words were spoken to a handsome little spaniel which perched high upon a shelf which ran along one side of the receiving room, about 4 feet above the sorting table, was fussing and whining to be taken down. His master always put him there for safe keeping, and there he would remain for hours, watching all that went on with his sharp black eyes, and awaiting his master's "Come, Coco," to spring fully 6 feet into his outstretched arms, confident that those arms would never fail him, for had not his mother before him sat upon that broad shelf, day after day, for years, and trained her son to do likewise? Then, when old age came creeping upon her, and she was forced to remain at home, she resigned the care of her beloved master to her doughty son, feeling sure that her responsibility was wisely shifted. But Coco's ears were sharper than his master's, and he had heard a sound proceeding from one of those mail bags the like of which he had never heard before. A second later there was shaken upon the mail table from out of one of the bags a wee, squirming, half-dead kitten. One wild, reckless leap, and Coco was upon the table, licking and whining over poor little Tommy Post Office. Then excitement reigned supreme for a while, for never before in all the history of the Hartford post office had a mail pouch dropped upon the sorting table such a missive as this. If Uncle Sam's postal officials neglected their duties that Thanksgiving day, the Postmaster General would have been obliged to accept a funny enough excuse for their having done so. The wording might have run somewhat in this wise: "Owing to the unexpected arrival of a tiny black and white kitten, whose state of health required instant attention at the hands of the postal force, the mail was temporarily delayed." In less than half a jiffy, Robert Weston had picked up the forlorn little kitten. In another jiffy he had sent one of the men out to buy some milk, and funniest of all, a doll's nursing bottle. When the man returned, the milk was warmed, and Tommy Postoffice was initiated in artificial feeding, with Koko sitting close beside him and cocking up first one ear and then the other, as though he felt it in his duty to supervise. The kitten heartened up wonderfully under this care, and took his rations like a little major. Then, wearied from the hustling about he had undergone in the mail-bag, he was only too glad to snuggle down beside Koko when Mr. Weston laid an overcoat upon one corner of the table and said, "Here, old man, you've got a job now, and no mistake. Lie there and take care of this infant until it is time for us to go home to our Thanksgiving dinner." Koko seemed proud of his honors. The kitten cuddled close to his warm side, nestled in under his long silky hair, and went fast asleep as a dormouse, and neither animal stirred until 11 o'clock struck upon the big clock nearby. Then the post office closed its doors for the day, and the officials went to their various homes to do justice to our national gobbler. When he was ready to take his departure, Robert Weston called the dog, picked up the kitten, and dropped it into his pocket, and went his way to his boarding house, where he was a universal favorite with old and young, as well as every animal upon the place. Peggy Post Office, far away in the post office at R, little guessed the scene in which her son was figuring as the star actor. For Tommy's adventure had to be related again and again, Tommy himself shown to everyone, petted, admired, and marveled over, until it was a wonder his head was not hopelessly turned then and there. But he was destined to have an eventful life, and his journey was only the beginning of his wonderful experiences. Chapter 2. Tommy Becomes a Pensioner. "Swell the fund. Help along a good cause. You ought to be proud to see your name on the list. Mr. Weston says we're to adopt the kitten and that the boys have got to chip in for his support, so here's a chance for him to do the generous act. How much do you contribute?" asked Ben, the morning which followed Tommy's arrival at Hartford, as he went about among the men filled with importance and carrying a little book and pencil. On the cover was printed in rather irregular letters, "Subscriptions for the support and feed of the post office cat. He ain't got no name yet." The big words had been spelled by one of the men whose educational advantages had been somewhat superior to Ben's, but the last statement had been his own afterthought. "What are you trying to get at, anyhow?" asked one of the letter carriers, as he looked over the boy's shoulder. "Trying to get at your pocket, so hand over something and write your name down in this book for the same amount each week. Mr. Weston says that kitten what come in the mail bag yesterday deserves to be made the P.O. cat, and that us fellers has got to take care of it. So what's your figure?" 5 cents a week, and here's your nickel for a starter. Say, if the whole force gives a nickel each week, that cat's gonna bust, sure. Hand over your subscription list and let me sign." So the list went the rounds of the office, and not a man withheld his mite, and the kitten's maintenance was assured from the outset. Meantime, he was, of course, nameless. "Say, Mr. Weston, what are you going to call him?" asked Ben as he handed the subscription book into his superior's hands and dumped upon his desk the pile of pennies and nickels which had collected in his cap. "Mean to write to the place he came from and try to figure out if he has one already. Ben, my boy, that cat's no common, everyday sort of cat. If you believe in astrology, you'll know that the stars had something to do with his arrival. Do you?" And a mischievous twinkle came into Robert Weston's eyes as he looked at the office boy. "In what, sir? Guess I ain't up much in these Chinese names. Don't see what the stars has to do with this kitten, neither. Maybe he saw some in that mail bag, though, before he got here. Lord, I don't see what kept him from being squashed all to smash, the way them things is hustled round." "It was Kismet. That's what did it, my boy. That cat has a mission to fulfill. You see if he hasn't." "Kismet? Kismet? Don't you mean catnip? That's the stuff that makes 'em feel so funny that they act like they was drunk. I never heard of the other stuff. What is it?" "No, I don't mean catnip. That's good in its way, but it can't hold a candle to Kismet, Ben. That's the thing what keeps you from being all smashed up if you happen to find yourself in a railway accident, or from falling off a cliff in the dark. great thing, Kismet. That kitten knew about it, sure. That's the reason he got here without being killed on the way." And Robert Weston, that combination of fun and seriousness, wagged his head at the mystified boy. "Is it a charm for fair?" Ben asked in an awestruck voice. His life had been a life of vicissitudes ever since he was a wee lad, and book lore was unknown to him. He was, however, naturally quick-witted and adaptive, and possessed a fund of good nature which seemed inexhaustible. It never occurred to him that had Kismet so ordained, he, instead of a little lost kitten, might have been the one to have a collection taken up for his benefit. So go things in this world. Robert Weston looked at the boy for a moment without replying, and probably something of the above thought passed through his mind. His reply was, "Benny, some fellows think that they can't get on a minute unless they have on hand a little of the very finest variety going, and that the world is to blame if they don't happen to get it. But let me tell you one thing, my boy. You'll be surprised to find out what a good sort you can turn out yourself if you use your wits. Just try it. But let's see what that kitten's bank account is." He began to count the coins which lay upon the desk before him. $1.33. That's a regular Vanderbilt income for a cat. If the boys turn over that sum each week, the kitten can wear jewels if he wants to. Say, you little buffer, do you know you have fallen upon your feet?" And he reached over to stroke the sleepy little creature which was curled up in one corner of his desk, its bed being an old fur cap which had passed through many and varied experiences upon its owner's head. The kitten roused up, got upon its feet, humped up its back to stretch, and yawned until its mouth seemed ready to split. "Whew, going to swallow every one of us. My, ain't you a big cat, though. Ready for your dinner now? You can have some cream if you want it, with such an income as this. Come on and take your bottle like a little major." A second later the kitten was tugging away at the little nursing bottle for dear life. Ben, in convulsions of laughter, and half a dozen of the men gathered about to watch the funny spectacle. Thus did Tommy come into his fortune, and soon after his true name. Before the week was ended he was duly christened, and the ceremony was a funny one. The morning that the letter arrived from R., Mr. Weston called the clerks together and said, "Boys, this kitten has got to be christened. He has come a long journey, nameless so far as the world knows, and that won't do for the Hartford post office cat. He's got to have a collar, and the collar has got to have his name, and the name of the post office on it, too. But he can't wear a collar until he gets a little bigger than a pint of peanuts. He'd walk clear through it, and we don't want him to wear a belt. We'll christen him today, right now. The collar can come when he has grown into it. His true name is Tommy Post Office, and he is the son of Peggy Post Office of R. So here goes. Tommy Post Office of Hartford, Connecticut, owned and supported by the boys of the office, who pledge themselves to your maintenance until you can hustle for yourself and to all the cats that try to invade your premises. In the names of the post office boys, I christen you Tommy Post Office, and set their seal and badge upon you fore and aft." Then, taking from his desk a 1 and 2 cent postage stamp, he wet them and stuck one upon the kitten's head and the other upon the end of his tail, where it whisked and flirted about, but stuck tight nevertheless. Passers-by would have been surprised to learn that the laughter which they heard within the staid old walls of the post office was caused by the pranks of a wee kitten whirling about after its own tail, upon which a green 1 cent stamp was firmly stuck. As though he realized his honors, Tommy Post Office made haste to grow both in size and beauty, to say nothing of intelligence. That he was rapidly becoming the smartest cat going, any man in the employ of the Hartford Post Office would have assured you, but would also have bridled with resentment had your face expressed a doubt which your lips were, perhaps, too polite to give voice to. But there was no denying that Tommy was going to be a beauty. When the warm days of early spring came, he had grown as big as several pints of peanuts, and had also grown into the handsome collar bought for him. His hair was as black as shiny as jet, his shirt front as immaculate as drifted snow, and his stockings were washed and scoured hourly, lest any vestige of dirt should adhere to them. He had learned to know the men, and was boon companion with each and every one of them. He also knew the hour of the day, or night, that each would arrive to go on duty, and was invariably on hand to welcome them when the big door swung open. He also knew their luncheon hours, whether they happened to be midday or the midnight hour, which night duty made necessary, and was always ready to sit down beside them to wait the tidbit which he knew would be his share. If they happened to be so hungry that he was in danger of being forgotten, he had a way of recalling his presence to them. This was to jump upon their shoulders, and just as some particularly dainty morsel was about to pass their lips, to reach one deft paw forward, catch the food upon his claws, and presto! It regaled another palate than its owner had intended. The engineer was Tommy's special friend, and Tommy never failed to be on hand when Dan brought forth his lunch pail. Dan was very fond of cold sausage meat, and Tommy approved its taste. But Tommy was by no means a sluggard. If he lived in this post office, he meant that it should benefit by his industry. So from the earliest kittenhood he began to wage war upon the rats and mice, and as time went on not a whiskered head dared show itself. By this time Tommy was 6 months old, and as full of pranks as a 6-month-old kitten well could be. His education had begun the very moment he entered the Hartford post office, so it is not surprising that by the time he had spent half a year there, he was really remarkable. Chapter 3. Tommy as Commissariat. In Robert Weston, Tommy seemed to recognize his earliest friend, and even though fond of the other men, never showed them quite the delicate intentions which he reserved for Robert. One day, when Mr. Weston failed to go home to his dinner at the usual hour, Tommy seemed quite disturbed. He could not understand it at all. All the other men went at stated hours, and were welcomed by Tommy upon the return. How he knew that they had been dining no one could understand, although he seemed to be perfectly sure of it. Perhaps his cat's sense of smell revealed it to him. But upon this particular day, as Mr. Weston sat at his desk, noon hour came and passed without his usual departure for dinner. Tommy was disturbed, seriously disturbed. He jumped upon Mr. Weston's desk, warbled at him, jumped down again and ran towards the door, where he paused to look back to see if his friend would take the hint. He did not, and could not say to Tommy, "I am not going until 2 o'clock today, and then I am not coming back." The hour crept along, and still Tommy fidgeted. Mr. Weston was too absorbed in arranging his affairs for a week's holiday to notice that Tommy was acting in a most unusual manner, rubbing against his legs, brushing against his sleeve, watching him intently with his bright, shining eyes. But at length the cat could stand it no longer. 1 o'clock had struck, and his friend must surely be starving. With a more than usually prolonged and vehement meow wow wow, Tommy fled from the office. Mr. Weston looked up at that moment and caught sight of the vanishing black tail. He laughed and said, "What's up, Tommy? Seems to me I have a hazy idea that you've been making some sort of a row about here for the past hour, but I don't get a week's holiday very often, and you must excuse my preoccupation." Then he resumed his work. 20 minutes later, Tommy came bounding through the outer office as though he were pursued by a wild animal. He was merely a black streak as he leaped along. The swinging door leading into Mr. Weston's office was closed, but a whit cared Tommy for that. He had seen that door opened and shut too many times not to know that a good bang against it would cause it to swing in the desired direction. The bang came, and Tommy vanished. "Wonder what he's been up to now," said one of the men. A second later a plump, still wriggling mouse lay upon Mr. Weston's desk. If he hadn't sense enough to know when it was dinner time, Tommy had. The months slipped by. Spring had brought its balmy air and soft green foliage, summer its showers and sultry days. Not a fig cared Tommy Post Office for either. One day was much the same as another to him. Each morning brought him one set of friends who were sure to pet and feed him, play with him, and assure him that he was the finest cat in all Hartford. Each evening saw these depart to give place to another set. It was all the same to Tommy. As autumn days drew near, he began to put on his winter coat, and a truly splendid cat he was. His black coat was thicker and shinier than ever, his shirt front white as driven snow from many ablutions, and his stockings simply immaculate. And Tommy's expression had also changed during the 11 months spent in the Hartford post office. The funny little kitten face had given place to the wise cat's, and he now looked at you as though he knew every bit as much as you did and was well aware of the fact. If he had grown to be a vain, self-conscious cat, it was all due to the boys who told him 20 times a day that he was the handsomest cat in town. He was known throughout the neighborhood, and in the post office grounds, as well as in the office itself, was literally monarch of all he surveyed. And woe to the cat or dog which dared invade Tommy's domain. Dogs. Tommy was fully convinced that dogs belonged in an entirely different world, and should under no circumstances be tolerated in this one. At least, all dogs but Coco. He was, of course, an exception, and a privileged character because Robert Weston was his master. During Tommy's kittenhood, Coco had been his guardian, but Tommy had made haste to put kittenhood behind him, and to grow into a splendid big cat who needed no guardian whatever, but was fully capable of acting as guardian to some lesser creature, should he feel inclined to do so. He and Coco were friends. That is, they passed the time of day when Coco arrived at the office in the morning, and once in a while lapped from the same bowl of water, but these were concessions to politeness. Tommy could take care of himself very well indeed, and Coco was perfectly willing that he should do so, for Coco had his opinion of cats, and felt that his master would have all he could comfortably attend to if he paid the attention he should pay to the friends whom he had known longest. So Coco watched Tommy from the vantage point of his shelf above the sorting table, turned up his little snub nose a degree higher when Tommy gave way to an exceptionally wild kittenish freak, or politely crowded over closer to the wall when Tommy jumped up to take a siesta beside him, as, once in a blue moon, he would do. It was noon hour upon a glorious October day when Tommy's first adventure began to shape itself. The air was crisp and clear, the sun shining gloriously. Crimson and yellow leaves were fluttering to the ground from the great elms and maples which grew in the post office park, and Tommy was perched upon one of the window seats watching them as they fell. Presently the temptation to play with them became too great, and away he went in hot chase after a particularly gorgeous one. Thither and yonder he darted after the fluttering bits of color, chasing up and down in pursuit of them. Over the lawn, down the paths, and even out upon the sidewalk, only to tear back again and dash up a tree in his mad frolic. But Tommy was too well fed to romp very long without a rest, and at length grew weary from his exertions. Next in order was a resting place, and this he proceeded to hunt up. A row of mail wagons stood backed up to the rear end of the office, the horses taking their dinners from their nose bags while they waited for the wagons to be filled with the outgoing mail. Small thought had these sedate animals for the flyaway cat racing over the grass. But when Tommy found himself in need of a resting place, he turned his attention to the wagons, for his sense of smell was keen, and those wagons smelt of the mail bags. Indeed, some of the bags were already in them, and Tommy's love of mail bags was not surprising. So into one of the mail bags he jumped, made his way to the front part of it, and in 2 minutes was fast asleep upon his old friends, the pouches. Then minutes or hours might have passed. Tommy neither knew nor cared. The first intimation he received that his bed was not a fixture occurred when a rude jounce aroused him from dreaming of a feast of fine mice, and at the very moment he thought he was about to pounce upon one, thumpity, bumpity, bang went his bed, and Tommy was bounced upon his feet in a most unceremonious manner. It was well for the driver of that mail wagon that he could not see through the wooden partition which shut in the mail bags from the storm and shower. Could he have done so, he would have been frightened out of his wits, for Tommy's eyes were simply glaring green sparks, and his tail standing out as stiff as a bottle brush, as he stood bracing himself upon the mail bags, and wondering what upon earth would happen next. He learned very quickly, for Uncle Sam's mail wagons are not, as a rule, either new or modern. They serve many years, and they serve well. Nor are the horses which draw them noted for their youth and blue blood. They, too, have served. The horse which drew this particular wagon was no exception to his kind. He went gallumping along, for everything must make way for such a glorious institution as the United States mail, and the wagon behind him bounced and thumped along too. Over the car tracks, around corners, rattling over a paved street, rolling along an asphalted one, in and out among a crush of vehicles it went, for it was late for the mail train soon due at the big railroad station, and the driver was trying to make up lost time. Tommy felt like a ping-pong ball as he was bounced about from one side to the other of the wagon. To say that he was angry does not convey the very faintest idea of his state of mind. He was wild with rage, frantic with fear, filled from the tip of his nose to the very end of his bristling tail with indignation. Never in all his life, that he could recall, had he been treated with so little respect, or been so battered about, for he did not remember his journey to Hartford. Wild yowls of protest announced his state of mind to the world, but the noes outside the wagon drowned them. Up Asylum Street rattled the wagon, around a corner and up to the New York, New Haven, and Hartford station. That horse knew what was expected of him, and in just about no time had whisked the mail wagon around and into its place, with the back doors up to the platform. The doors were unlocked and thrown open. Meow, row, row. A black and white streak, a flash of green lightning, a sable plume, and out flew Tommy. The man who held the door bounded backward, lost his balance, and tumbled heels over head. Tommy merely used him as a stepping stone to higher things, for he was going somewhere, and going in a hurry. The man scrambled to his feet, took one look at the object flying down the street towards Capitol Park, and cried, "Lord save us, but it's Tommy Post Office, as I live. Now it's all me life is worth to go back to that office widout that darned cat, but how under heaven am I ever going to lay hands on that streak of lightning?" But Michael Curran, veteran mail driver for the Hartford Post Office, need not have experienced any concerns about Tommy, for Tommy was quite capable of taking care of himself, nor could Michael spare time to chase after the runaway. His duty lay with the mail bags in his charge, and with those about to arrive from New York. The moment the big, panting engine drew up to the station, the heavy pouches were hurled from the mail car, caught up by the station hands, and hurried into the waiting wagons. But once his wagon was filled, and he took up the reins to drive back to the post office, Michael held a long conversation with himself concerning Tommy, and his possible fate in that big city. But we must follow Tommy, for he was destined to figure in another episode before he reached his old home, the post office, again. Chapter 4. Tommy in the Guise of Cupid. On raced the cat, helter-skelter, pell-mell. He neither looked nor cared where he was going. His object was to get out of and away from that dark place in which he had been confined. But agile and active as he was, the big city, the busy streets, the noise and clatter all about him caused him to halt a moment, and in that moment he was espied by a terrier, which boasted the unenviable record of never having missed his prey when that prey was a cat. There was a bound, a yelp, and one desperate scratch. Mr. Terrier drew back a half-second, and that was enough for Tommy. Across the street, almost under trolley cars, over the lawn of the pretty park he darted, his pursuer hot upon his heels. It was a wild race for life and liberty, and Tommy paused not upon the order of his going. A short distance within the park stood a row of seats. On the end one sat a young girl reading. Her back was toward Tommy. It would have made no difference to him had her face been turned that way. One side was quite as good as the other to him, for the boost he needed to get up the tree beneath which she was sitting, and the next thing she knew there was a rush, a scramble, a general hurrah, and up her back darted a cat to claw up the tree and glare derisively at the bristling dog, which seemed disposed to follow his example and use the lady for a step-ladder. In one instant there was a change of positions. But this girl was not given to shrieking or making a fuss. Her parasol stood beside her, and it had a good stout handle. Mr. Terrier did not want a second rap upon his broad crown with it, and when his master came upon the scene, that master received some very wholesome advice upon the subject of permitting his dog to chase a cat, for this girl loved cats. The dog was put in a leash and led away. Next came the problem of rescuing Tommy Postoffice. But Tommy was a wiseacre. No sooner had that dog vanished than meow came from the crotch of the tree where he sat. Poor kitty, poor kitty, come pussy, come down, called the young girl, and Tommy proceeded to accept the invitation. Bit by bit down he crept, at length turning backward and letting himself down by his claws. The last wriggle, the final clutch, was made, and Tommy was safe in her outstretched arms. Poor pussy, you certainly had a close call that time. Now sit here in my lap, and get over your fright, then we'll see what can be done. Let me see to whom you belong. She turned the collar about in order to read the inscription. As she did so, a gentleman stopped in front of her, and raised his hat, and said, I beg your pardon, but will you tell me how in the name of all that is wonderful Tommy Postoffice happens to be in your lap? Tommy, you old scamp, how came you way out here? Meow, wow, wow, warbled Tommy, deserting his rescuer to spring to Robert Weston's shoulder, from which vantage point he grinned upon the girl as though to say, You didn't know that cats were gifted with second sight, perhaps. I could tell you a thing or two if I wished to, but I guess I won't. Why, Mr. Weston, does he belong to you? I've only an interest in him. He is Uncle Sam's property, and I'm still guessing as how he came here. I am glad to meet you again, Miss Westfield. You see, I'm renewing my acquaintance on the strength of Tommy's intimacy, and having heard you sing so often at St. Mark's. And Robert Weston smiled pleasantly upon the girl sitting there with the soft autumn light all about her. I am pleased to have you do so, I'm sure. How fortunate that you happened along in time to rescue the cat. It looks as though the rescuing has already been done, and all that remains for me to do is escort this gentleman back home, and thank you in the name of the post office boys for befriending him. You would do well to make your manners, old man, and come back to the office with me. Robert Weston dropped upon the seat as he spoke, and Tommy promptly hopped down upon his lap, rubbed against him, and then settled himself down for a siesta. Made up your mind to spend the rest of the day here, old man? Tommy warbled contentedly. The park was beautiful in its autumn dress, the air soft and dreamy as one could wish, Mr. Weston a tower of strength against officious dogs and mischievous boys, the young lady beside them as pretty as a dream. So what better place could be found? Tommy said within himself, Let well enough alone. 20 minutes passed as 20 minutes have a trick of passing when one is agreeably entertained, and neither Robert Weston nor Tommy took heed. Then Miss Westfield rose to her feet, saying, This will never do for a busy music teacher, Mr. Weston. You know I am a business woman nowadays, and must look to my pupils' voices. Meow, meow, warbled Tommy. Miss Westfield broke into a merry laugh as she asked, Does he understand the human tongue, Mr. Weston? Looks like it. Want your voice cultivated, Tommy, old man? What were those, chest or throat notes? I am sure that I shall have to take him in hand. What a promising pupil he would make with that remarkable rolling of his R's. Shall we begin at once, Tommy? You will have to learn the way to my studio. She stroked the cat, which was now perched upon the seat, and looking at them with wisdom written all over him. You will have to come to Tommy's house, Miss Westfield, said Mr. Weston, looking at her in a manner which caused a pretty colour to creep into her cheeks, for although he had seen Mary Westfield many times before, and had occasionally spoken with a pretty soprano of St. Mark's, somehow he had never realized how very attractive she was until Tommy undertook to awaken him to that fact. Oh, no, my pupils all come to me, Mr. Weston, and I cannot make an exception in Tommy's case. Very well, then. There is only one thing to be done. Tommy's voice must be cultivated, and I shall have to see that he attends to it without further delay. I fear that valuable time has already been lost. I shall bring him to the studio myself. It may have to be after our business hours, for our time is precious. Isn't it, Tommy? He said, as he stooped to pick up the cat and place him upon his shoulder. And we shall have to take our music lessons in the evening. Will that be convenient, Miss Westfield? Provided you do not ask for too many a week. My time, too, is very valuable, you know, and particularly my evenings. Mary Westfield's eyes were very bewitching, and her voice had a ring of fun in it. They had now reached the edge of the park, where their paths divided. "Good morning, Mr. Weston. I wish you a safe journey with your unusual charge. Goodbye, Tommy Post Office. I hope to hear good reports of you." "Goodbye, Miss Westfield. Many thanks for your kindness to this chap. The boys will appreciate it. Come and see him upon his native heath some time. He's worth seeing there, I assure you." "I do not doubt it. Some time perhaps I will. Thank you. Goodbye." Now what freak entered the head of the ever-freakish Tommy just at that moment no one will ever be able to tell. He had known Robert Weston as long as he had been able to know anything, and he had known Mary Westfield barely 30 minutes. Yet right there in the very midst of the big city, with noise and confusion all about him, he chose to desert the friend whom he had known for months, and in whom he should have had implicit faith, to spring to the shoulder of a slip of a girl whom the terrier, from which he had so recently escaped, could have thrown right off her small feet. Mary Westfield gave a jump which very nearly unseated him, the move was so unexpected. "You little rascal!" cried Mr. Weston, making a dive for the erratic animal. But Tommy evaded him and sprang to the ground. Then began a pretty chase. Up the park for about 100 feet tore Tommy, then stopped and waited for them to overtake him. Mr. Weston ran after him. The cat let him come almost within reach, then off he darted again, up the hill, straight for Asylum Avenue, as though the very spirit of mischief were in him. Now it is no use denying that Mr. Weston had a pretty correct idea of the figure he was cutting as he chased along in the middle of the highway after a runaway cat, but there are times when one is prepared to make a mighty effort to control one's temper. Mary Westfield, with a very amused smile upon her lips, and her eyes fairly dancing, followed slowly behind the chaser and the chased. Anything more tantalizing than that cat it would have been difficult to conceive of. One moment tearing along the sidewalk, the next rolling over and over in the grass which grew beside it, Tommy seemed to say, "What is the use of your trying to catch me? I can escape you every time and only half try. See? See? Moreover, I am taking you in the very direction you know perfectly well you would like to go if you only had half an excuse, and here I am giving you the best one ever heard of, the rescue of the post office cat. So come on. Number 8 isn't so very far up, and you can ride back in a trolley car if you are in such a dreadful hurry." There is little doubt that Tommy Post Office would have succeeded in carrying out his scheme to perfection, had not a small boy interfered. Tommy had not counted upon him, but there he was, and in just about a second Tommy had run straight into him. There was a wild scramble, and Tommy was a prisoner. If Mr. Weston gave him a little shake when he took him from the boy, the impulse was wholly due to time lost from postal duties, and not because a pair of laughing eyes were looking roguishly into his as Miss Westfield came up.